are good to go. All right, take it away.
All right, thanks, Teresa. I'm really happy to be here in New Ulm this morning. I retired last summer, and one of the things I wanted to do was see more of Minnesota. So this is the kind of thing. I was in Park Rapids last month, and New Ulm this month. I've been to Mankato. I've been to Crookston, so I'm getting a chance to see Minnesota and meet people doing a lot of great things. In my role as a coordinator for Census and Redistricting, what I do is I'm really working to provide tools, information, and support to members like you on being effective in these areas. So, think about what I can do for you. I'll mention right at the start here my email address, and I've started putting it on slides, is P. Huffman, so my first initial and last name Huffman at lwvmn.org. So if you want to send me a question, write me an email, whatever. What I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to give a quick overview on census, where we are in the census in process. A lot of the preparation is done as far as legislation and things like that. There is more that can be done yet to be successful in the census. So that's really my focus. And then on redistricting, there's a lot of information on this. What I've done is just distilled that down to a short bit of information, an overview on census and what we're doing on that, and the People Power Fair Maps campaign, which I suspect you've heard of. As Teresa said, we want to hold questions to the end, but if something isn't clear, you got a question of clarification, please just let me know and we'll answer that. All right, so moving on, the census. Like I said, we're getting into the execution of the census now, and if you take a look, right now, invitations are going to go out here in just about 6 weeks. In March, 12th to the 20th, people will be receiving letters in the mail with how to respond to the census. And I'll talk over this in a minute about how to do that, but it'll talk about what you need to do, where to go, what papers to fill out, and the options to do that. The 26th to 3rd is a reminder letter. The effective date of the census, if you think about that, is April 1st. That is a date that is based on where you live, primary residence on that date. The reminder letter goes out at the end of March to let people know, hey, the census, you need to respond, just a reminder of that. April 1st is when that comes up. Then coming up later in April, for those households that haven't responded, there'll be another reminder and a paper questionnaire. So people have the option to respond by paper. The primary means of responding right this year is through the internet, through an internet portal. But there are other options. And then starting at the end of April, there's a final reminder that goes out by postcard to those households that haven't participated. And then starting at the end of April through August is when census workers go and they go in the field to find those households and those individuals who have not responded. So, in order to minimize the cost of the census, the government, respond early, respond to that. If you really don't want to have somebody coming to your home and asking questions, then respond to the census. Now, a little bit of background, why do we have a census? And I think you had a legislative forum recently that talked a lot about census. Representation is a big one. Our representation in Minnesota in Congress and House of Representatives is based on census results, and local legislative representation is based on census. So what happens in redistricting come 2021 will be based on those results of the census. So it's really important to make sure people are fairly represented. The federal government programs give money out, a lot of that based on census results. How many people are in states, communities, locales that need those services. A lot of that is, and I've got a separate list if you're interested, and it's a part of our website issue summary, there's a lot of USDA, FHA funding that is based on census. So agriculture is very important here, and a lot of that funding is dependent on how many people that responds. And finally, government and business both do a lot of planning based on census information. Where do they need services, emergency services, support services, where to build new businesses, where to provide services, things like that. And a couple of things to think about, $15 billion a year comes through census allocated funding. Representation, growth, and then businesses. One of the keys is historically undercounted communities. There are groups of people that historically aren't well represented in the census. They don't respond for a variety of reasons. Children, people of color, indigenous people, and then urban and rural households. Children, people a lot of times forget children, infants to 4 years old. They forget. Are they really people? They are. They count. They need services, they need representation, so count the children. A lot of times people of color, indigenous peoples, they may have changing addresses, they may not have an address in some cases. And then rural areas, there's people who don't trust the government. They don't want the government to know where they are. The government's not getting a lot of information about you from this. But those are people we need to reach out to and educate and involve. You look at these numbers about how many people are included, about a quarter of the population of Minnesota is in a historically undercounted community. They're renters, they're maybe people of color, they're mobile, students, young adults. A lot of people fall into that. Now, if you think in terms of those numbers, with the population of Minnesota is about 5.6 million people. If we undercount by 1%, that's 56,000 people. That's the difference between having 8 congressional seats and 7 congressional seats. If you look at money, 56,000 people is about $115 million, depending on how you look at the numbers. But that's a lot of money. So that 1%, so everybody needs to get counted, and we need to help people get into that process. The ways to respond online, which I talked about, there's a phone option, there's a mail option. So primarily the Census Bureau wants us to respond through the internet, but there are these other options if people have access to the internet, not comfortable with that, would prefer another method. And those instructions will come in the questionnaire in the mail. The questions, here's what the census is going to ask. And there is available online if you want to get a sample census form. There is one online, or I can send it to you if you'd like. All it's going to ask is for each household, how many people? Is it a house or apartment? Do you own or rent? Telephone number. Then each person, name, gender, date of birth, race. There is no citizenship question. And I know there's still confusion, and that's one of the things, the problem is there's confusion about what's required. You don't have to talk national origin. You do have to give race, because there's things that are racially based from the standpoint of voting rights and things like that. But you don't talk national origin, you don't talk citizenship. That's very limited information. The one other thing I'll mention is that even if you don't answer all the questions, your form gets counted. But somebody may still come to your house and ask questions, the enumerator. Now, the enumerators, I could talk a lot about security if you're interested in that, but they are required by law to maintain that information confidential. All right, resources. So we're at the point where we got to get everybody counted. That's what's really key. So what are the resources? Number one, we need people working as a census, as enumerators, and we were talking before we started that those census jobs actually pay pretty well, depending on what role you're in. If you're interested in a census job as an enumerator or some other role, Minnesota's got a website. Their 2020 census site has a link on how to apply for jobs. And then, obviously, the Census Bureau has a link. So just, if not you, if you know somebody who's looking for something to fill in a little extra income or wants to get out in the community, this is a great opportunity. The state has what's called complete count committees. Has anybody heard of complete count committees? Yeah. Somebody on a complete count committee? Oh, great. Yeah, it is great. I mean, I think, and and Nick and I participate with the state complete count committee. And it's a really great opportunity to pool resources, knowledge, work together. The league brings a certain number of skills and experiences. Some of those other groups have access to communities that need help, and so how do we work with them? And it's really an opportunity to strengthen our connection with the community. So just looking, there's over 250 complete count committees in Minnesota now, about 255. Some of them are community-based, like there's Asian Pacific Islanders have a complete count. There's an elder complete count. And then you look in the area here, New Ulm, you have a complete count. In other locales, Medelia, Nicollet, St. Peter, Mankato, Blue Earth County. So I think in Minnesota we've done a really good job with the complete count committee structure. So I'm glad you're engaged in that. some resources that are available. There's videos on the Minnesota Census website, on Census 101, 102. There's foreign language videos. Those will be available on the 15th of January. So they're not up there yet, but in foreign language. So if you've got communities where Spanish, Somali, Hmong may be important and useful to them, then there are resources for those. So and that's on the PowerPoint. There is a link to that. Language information. Forms there will be information available in 73 languages, and that's the list, so it's a lot. There will be forms available in 12 languages for the census. So again, it's an effort to reach out to every person, every community for the census to make sure we count everybody. There's a help desk. This is actually live now. I've been kind of texting messages. This is kind of like a expert system. If you have heard of that, it basically learns by people asking questions. It'll get better answers to questions as time goes on. You text to that. You can do questions in Hmong, Somali, and Spanish as well. There's an example there on the right. This is actually California. They piloted this system. But that's another way that people can ask questions. It's anonymous, and you get questions anytime you need to. And there is an option for referral. If somebody needs somebody to call them, with either foreign language or additional information, that'll kick it out to that. There'll be basically a response center during the census to help people with that. And then as far as the league goes from a state standpoint, we've got an issue summary online. We've got an census action kit. I am in the process of updating the action kit. Should be updated this week. We do have a summary on determining residence for college students, because I know that's a question about, you got a college student, where do they reside? Are they reside at their home when they're not in school, or are they at school? So there's a document there that helps with that. Nick wrote that, and it's really, really good. We have a sample. The next couple of things, two things will be posted this week. We do have a sample city or county ordinance for census worker access to multi-residence facilities, think apartments, condos, senior living facilities, things like that. A lot of times the front door is locked. You have to have access. The census regulations require census workers to have access, but they have no enforcement ability. So, and a building owner or operator may choose not to give access. There is a draft ordinance written up by the state, the Democrator's office, and a couple of counties as a model that could be used, or it could be turned into a resolution in order to reemphasize the need to give access to the census workers to get a complete count, so we don't lose out on representation, funding, and so on. And then a resolution for establishing complete count committees. I think people have got that pretty well figured out, but if you need help with that, we can help with that too. That's it on census. So what I'm going to do is transition. Now there's a linkage here between census and redistricting. Census is what determines how many people you have. Redistricting is who gets represented. Now the timeline for census, we've got the response here in March, April. The enumerators go out in basically May through July, August. By the end of December, the director of the Bureau of Census Bureau, has to send to the president what the apportionment numbers are for each state for congressional seats. That happens by the end of December. And then in early January, it's within the first week of the new congressional session in January, the president is required to send those to Congress. Then Congress is required to turn around and send those within about 2 weeks to the states. So by the end of January, the state of next year, 2021, the states are going to know how many representatives they have. And then that kicks into the states determining how to realign, redraw maps for congressional representation and legislative seats. So that's the relationship in the timeline. So talking about people, power, fair maps, and redistricting, what I'm going to give you is just a quick overview of what that looks like. Our key messages from a League of Women Voters standpoint is every voice should matter, every vote should count. And if districts are drawn in a way that takes away people's voices, doesn't count a race vote, then that's not aligned with our goals, which is empowering voters, defending democracy. And I think this is a great campaign because it really aligns with, if we're talking about empowering voters, defending democracy, if we ensure that the most accurate representation of the voters, then this is key to that. We should empower voters and maximize representation, that voters should choose their representatives rather than allowing politicians to choose their voters. And that's Michigan. A number of states have gone through this and have amended constitutions or put in new legislation. Michigan, it was people, not politicians. And it really is who decides who the reps represented. And there was one political strategist said, hey, redistricting is a great thing. It's every 10 years, politicians get to pick their voters instead of the voters picking the politicians. So that's why we think this is very important. Cheaters shouldn't win. I mean, and I was in business for 30 years, and I know every business and every person who wants to be successful, they figure out the rules, and they figure out how to maximize their success in the rules. Now, if you can figure out a way to work the rules to your benefit, then people will do that. That's human nature. It's not this party, that party, that's human beings. You want to be successful, you want to win. So we should not let people who find a way to game the system win at others' expense. So this is again about empowering voters and ending and preventing gerrymandering. How many people have heard of gerrymandering? All right. Yeah, just Edmund Gerry, 1812, and he was actually a Federalist. And it was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans back then. Okay, so it's, doesn't matter what party you are, everybody does it. And that's what, describes manipulation of district boundaries to benefit one group over another. And like I said, everybody does it. Everybody does it. All right, and that's the original gerrymander. It was Edmund Gerry. They said, hey, it looks like a salamander. So that's why they called it that. There is something I'll just recommend to you. There's something called the gerrymandering alphabet, and if you Google that online, it's different districts in the shape of letters, and they're not always gerrymandered, but it's really entertaining. It just tells you the links that sometimes organizations go through to get what they want. So the People Power Fair Maps campaign. Why are we doing that? The Supreme Court last spring, ruled that political gerrymandering was not within the jurisdiction of the federal courts. The Constitution gives that responsibility to the states. The state constitutions and legislation directs how that's done within each state, and therefore the states need to sort that out. Regardless of how you fall on that, I think that that's actually a good thing, because that gives us the ability not to rely on the federal courts to make this, because I think we've relied for too long on the courts to make this decision, which is really a political policy decision. So that lets us then work within each state to change the state constitution and the legislation in order to make this fair for the voters. So the League of Women Voters identified, said, fine, this is a state level thing. We're located in all 50 states. We'll have a nationwide 50-state initiative to create fair maps. And then how maps are drawn. Real high level. Redistricting. Sometimes people get redistricting and reapportionment confused. Reapportionment is, saying to each state how many seats you get in Congress. Redistricting is what the states do to determine what those maps look like. So that's redistricting as a state, reapportionment as federal. And as you think about that. And redistricting includes a lot of other things. A lot of times like city council lines, school board lines, county council lines, those things, depending on where that goes back to the census. And it also goes back to being engaged in a political process. So that's where this is not a just this spring kind of thing. Redistricting is going to go on for another year. If you think about the legislative session in 2021 is where the maps will be redrawn. Think about your local areas when you redo city council maps, county council, school boards. That also is going to go into the redistricting process and how that map gets drawn. So when every state does their own process, I've got a list that says what every state does, and it is very different between different states. And in most states, the standard model is the legislature draws them, governor can approve or veto. In some states, the governor doesn't get a vote. In some states, the governor, Arkansas, the governor, the attorney general, and secretary of state draw it, and the legislature approves it. And Arkansas is really different. Florida, the Supreme Court draws it. Okay, so it really varies. So every state gets to choose how they do that. But there's three things that are really the elements of redistricting. The people, who makes the decision and draws the map, who gets to do that? All right, is it legislatures? Is it a commission? The principles, what are the criteria? what are the rules, or what are you considering to do that? And there's a lot of things that can be considered. The order of those things is important. What are you trading off? Because it's all a trade-off. It's very complicated. And then finally, the process. What meetings are held, what visibility is there, what's public input, a lot of that. Now, Minnesota, we've got some information we share on federal and state laws, but in Minnesota, there's very little written down about what's required. There's generally not much transparency. There's no public involvement. There's really very little by way of specific criteria in Minnesota. So there's a lot of opportunity to make this more transparent and more fair. This is an example of redistricting criteria. On the left is court-driven criteria. Now, since 1960, basically every redistricting has been driven by the courts in Minnesota, either because the governor and the legislature couldn't agree, or because in the 60s, because the way it was done didn't align with Supreme Court decisions about one person, one vote, equal population in districts. And so basically since 1960, the courts have always done it. And some people say, well, why isn't that okay? Courts are doing a great job. Well, the courts look very legalistically at what they're doing. And so they're very driven by equality and population. So much so that, and I've got it with me, is both of the court judgments from 2000 and 2010, they want to be as close to the same as possible in the congressional districts. They're within one person. Okay, and if you're putting so much emphasis on the quality population, how much weight are you giving to other things that might be important from a fairness standpoint? So legally, they're going to make sure to equal the population, and they're not disadvantaging any racial minorities, because those are legal requirements. But if you look at that list, convenient, contiguous, they're going to give some emphasis on that. But then other things are going to fall by the wayside, because it's not a legally binding requirement. They're going to do what they have to do to make it legal, and that's really it. Whereas if you have a commission or some other structure, they can consider other things and balance those things out. So that's, and I'll let you look at those specifics on the, commission criteria. But then through legislation, we can decide what are the criteria that are going to be considered? What is the order in those criteria? What do we give the most importance to? And make some decisions about what we think is most fair. And I mentioned this, the Minnesota experience in redistricting. And again, the courts will draw with a very strong focus on the legal requirements and not much on the other items. And I want to just, the People Power Fair Maps campaign in Minnesota, what we are out to accomplish is to, first of all, educate and engage league members on this campaign, what the need is and what the process is, and that's part of what we're doing here today. Also working as a coalition with the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy to get legislation in front of the legislature that legislative leaders are aligned with and agree to, that they could potentially support in order to make changes to this process. And then we need to engage and educate the public in understanding and supporting redistricting reform. And through the media and through your engagement and our engagement with the public, raising that public awareness and public support for that. What I found is that from across the political spectrum, and when you frame to people that, hey, look, shouldn't we have fairly drawn maps that accurately represent the voters? Everybody goes, well, yeah. I mean, it seems to make sense, unless you're the one who's in the position to benefit from drawing the maps. Then it's a little bit different. So again, doesn't matter which party you're with. So we want to engage the voters, engage the public, because ultimately it's increasing awareness and support of legislators to make changes in this process to make it more fair. Any solution that gets made is going to have to go through the legislature, whether it's changes in laws, changes in the Constitution. Those things all have to go to the legislature. So ultimately, they're going to listen to the voters. If this is important to voters, then they'll think it's important. If it's not important to voters, if it's not one of the things you're hearing, then they're less likely to expend the energy on that. The current legislative strategy, and Nick can give you a lot more detail on this, basically is proposed legislation includes a nonpartisan advisory commission with an option for constitutional amendment, with a nonpartisan commission to perform redistricting. So, and there's a lot of ways that can play out, but we've got our own preferred approach, but we want to get legislation into place that provides for a nonpartisan commission. And then if passed, assure a minimum implementation of a nonpartisan redistricting commission if an amendment is not approved. So there's a variety of approaches to this that would assure that something is in place, some improvement in this. If nothing else, to look at the process, make sure there's greater transparency, engagement of the public meetings. Even Texas has public meetings. And the league is very involved. I can tell you what a lot of other states are doing, but the league in Texas is very engaged in the public process, educating the public about how that gets done. And there's other things we can do with that. All right, some resources for you. Issue summaries on the league website. There's presentations. This is an example. I've got a lot of different flavors of presentations that I can either provide or help you with, or I can come back. I've told folks I will go anywhere, anytime to talk about this. I am working with Nick and others on how do we get members of the league up to speed and able to do presentations to the public at a basic level on redistricting and gerrymandering and the campaign, so we engage more people, because ultimately it's going to come down to engaging more people in our communities. And finally, action kits and final review should be out within the next week or so. That's going to have other resources and other suggestions on what to do. This is the components, a lot of stuff there. Okay, there's a lot of things we can do to reach out to the public, to reach out to legislators, to reach out to members, to educate and involve and gain awareness for this subject. The question I get a lot is, what can I do? Well, there's a lot of stuff you can do. As league members, you can become a part of the Lobbying Observer Corps. Anybody, members of the public, can become part of the Action Alert program to get messages from the league about things that are important to elections and democracy, and then contact their legislators. So that's something anybody can do, and the link's on the website. Be prepared to support public outreach early this year. We've got to start getting out and connecting with the public, and so this is a part of getting connected and engaged with the league, and then help us with getting out to the public. Ask your legislator for their position on redistricting. There's a link here, and it's on our webpage, for the legislative interview guide, and there's in there asking those questions. Now, the other thing I would ask is, let us know when you've talked to a legislator about redistricting. What do they have to say? That's really helpful to us, and I also report up to national on what we're doing as far as how many contacts with stakeholders and public meetings and things like that. So it's great to hear the good things that people do. We're able to share that with others. It gives us insight to the political process, and then helps us with how you can help you more. Consider volunteering for a Speakers Bureau, which we talked about. Then after the legislative session this year, the 2020 session, there will be more work to do. We talked about there'll be redistricting early next year. There will be whatever gets passed the legislature has to get implemented. And when I talk to states like Michigan, when they have a constitutional amendment, well, they still we're fighting about what does that constitutional amendment look like? How does it get implemented? So there's more details to work through, and this is a never-ending process. We have to always stay engaged. We can never back off because, again, people are always looking to see how they can benefit from the way the rules are set up, and so we have to stay engaged with that. So there's more opportunities for that. I'll leave it there. Any quick questions before I turn it over to Nick? And we'll take more questions at the end.
Does the league have a preferred redistricting commission structure?
Our preferred structure is an independent commission, which would draw and approve the maps. Our preference is not to have a legislative approval. Now, there are some states where they have a commission that draws and approves, and the legislature can approve by a 3/4 or 2/3 vote. That assures that it's going to be, provides some assurance it'll be bipartisan, but other states don't. So that's our preferred. I think I got that right, Nick? Yeah.
I encourage you to look at Montana's, which was constitutionally mandated in '72. It is a commission. It is a bipartisan commission. They hold umpty-million hearings.
Yep.
It is not, the legislature does review it, but they don't have power over it. And it is because it was part of their constitution in 1972 that's the process. I'm guessing if they had a constitutional amendment today, they might not have an independent commission.
And it might be because they only had one congressional seat. Well, they're going to get a second congressional seat, all the things I look at. So Montana will have 2 seats. So they'll have to redistrict Montana for congressional purposes.
And
Yes, it will. That's a great point.
It's a public-driven process, though. It's, I very much support the commission.
Right.
It is bipartisan,
Right. No, that's a great point.
nonpartisan.
Iowa has a advisory commission that's appointed. It's like staff and others. They don't decide, but it's a very open process. And Iowa's like the gold standard for public openness and transparency. So no, thanks, Teresa.
One point on commissions, it takes longer because you're having hearings around the state. So redistricting in some states, the new districts don't take place in some instances till, in Montana, for example, it'll be 2024 until 2034 that redistricting occurs, even though the census is 2020.
All right.
So
All right.
under Minnesota's, I guess it would take place in the 2022 election unless it ended up in court.
Yeah, and the way the state constitution right now, it has to be done in the 2021 legislative session.
We don't have much time.
No, we don't. That's why there's some urgency with this. All right, I'll turn it over to Nick. We'll do a little mic swap here.
So I wanted to give you a quick overview of what the session might look like in general, and then also highlight some of the topics that the League of Women Voters of Minnesota will be working on this session. So, and this is just some of the issues we cover. So what's in the news that you've probably already seen, issues that is coming up. So first of all, we have a short session. We work on a 2-year biennium every year, or every 2 years in Minnesota under our Constitution. The legislature has a set number of days for that full biennium. And how the legislature has typically operated over the years is they have one longer session that starts in January, and then one shorter session that starts in February. And they both years they have to end by essentially the 3rd week of May. So they had a longer session last year that started in January. So this year it's going to be shorter. They're going to start in February. The first day of session is February 11th. So that doesn't sound like 3 weeks, but 3 weeks is a lot in terms of legislative time. It's really a lifetime almost. Secondly, the legislature will be having lots of discussions about our budget surplus. Right now, we do estimate that there will be a budget surplus. I can't remember what the latest number is, but there will be a budget surplus, and there will be discussions about what should be done with that. I know that Senate Republicans are very interested in returning that directly to the people in forms of tax breaks. I do believe that the House DFL and Governor Walz each have their own plans of what they'd like to do with that money, which may include some kind of returning money to folks in a tax break of some kind. But I do think that they also have other plans that they'd like to spend some of that money on what they think were things that, we should have it while we have the money. I will also say that some of that surplus money is by law required. I think we're required to bank, 10% of it. So no matter what, 10% of that has to be saved by the law. And then the rest of it is what they're talking about. What are we going to do with that? So that will be a contentious piece. This year is also a bonding year. So during the 2-year biennium, in the first year, it's typically a finance year and a budget year. So that's where they have to issue a 2-year budget to pay for, the executive branch and all the things the government does. In the second year, they typically issue supplemental finance bills. It's really just tweaks and edits and adding here or taking away there. There tends to be a lot of those, but it really is supplemental, is what they call it. But there are significant budget discussions, but they are considered supplemental. There's no government shutdown if they don't pass a supplemental bill, essentially. So they might do it, but it's not necessary. There's no shutdown involved. What they do then is during the second year is it's especially for bonding. So bonding is when the state government takes on debt to pay for certain programs or certain activities, which tend to be capital activities. So building roads, issuing grants, and paying for local communities to build things. That might be water quality systems. That might be roads and bridges. It might be a new community center. Tons of different programs of facilities that are paid for by debt taken on by the state. The interesting thing to note about bonding is that it is required by our state constitution to receive I can't remember what the number is, but it is a supermajority. It's not a simple majority. So every other bill that passes the legislature, you just need a simple majority in the House and a simple majority in the Senate. However, in Minnesota, you're required to get a supermajority. I can't remember if it's 2/3 or 3/5 or 60%, but it is a supermajority. What that means is not only do they need to get bipartisan support for the bonding bills, but making the House, which is currently controlled by the DFL, and the Senate, which is currently controlled by the Republicans, to agree. But you also need to get the House DFL and the House Republicans to agree, and get the Senate DFL and the Senate Republicans to agree. So you have to get the House to agree with each other, you have to get the Senate to agree with each other, you have to get them to agree with each other, and then you have to get them to agree with the governor. So you really have a House negotiation, a Senate negotiation, a House and Senate negotiation, and then a legislature and governor negotiation. So you've really got like 4 different stages you have to work through to get agreement on bonding. Policy, the other piece that they do is, since it's not a budget year, they tend to focus on policy. So that's where they're actually changing the content of the laws on how a department works, or adding or removing a criminal law, things like that. So it will be a policy year. And it also is the 2020 elections, which technically, in some ways, has nothing to do with the legislature, technically. But also everything to do with the legislature, because there will be a U.S. presidential election, there will be a U.S. Senate election, there will be every U.S. House in Minnesota will be reelected, every Senate seat will be reelected, every state House seat will be reelected. It is going to be nothing but elections for Minnesota in 2020. What that means for the legislature is that, yes, legislators and leadership will have an interest in supporting policy, but they will have an eye towards what will happen in November. And they know that whatever they do in the legislative session will be a topic of discussion during the campaigns leading up to November. So I like to say that there will be a lot of campaign-oriented nonsense and shenanigans. The legislators and leadership will be focused on not just how are we successful with a bonding bill this session, or how are we passing a bill this session, but how do we win elections in November. So for better or for worse, that will be on their minds, and that will affect how the legislative session plays out. And I will talk about the session topics that the league will be working on are these 4 topics: redistricting, voter assistance, which I'll get into more what that looks like, restore the vote, and legislative transparency. And like I said, I'll cover all those in more detail. So like I said, here's the number. It's $1.3 billion in extra revenue. So 10% automatically gets banked. The governor will want to spend some, and Republicans will want to send it back. I have heard specifically the idea of removing the healthcare provider tax. So last session was it last session? Yeah, I think it was last session. They added a healthcare provider tax, so a tax essentially on doctors and hospitals to pay for healthcare services in Minnesota. And what it is I have heard at least one Republican leader in the House, I believe, suggest that they want to remove the healthcare provider tax, since we have a budget surplus. Why do we need to be taxing folks? So, here's the numbers. So the House DFL, I have heard suggestions that they want to propose a bonding bill of over $3 billion. So that means there would be $3 billion in money to pay for projects, but that also means that the state would be taking on $3 billion of debt. Now, I will say that really right now, state debt is considered an investment for a lot of folks, because it is a very stable investment, because it's very unlikely that the state will go bankrupt. The state's going to keep up with its payments. So it is a very safe form of debt to take, of investment for people to say, I will give money, I will buy a bond so that the state can pay those things, because I know that the state will pay that money back. It's very, very, very unlikely that I won't get that money back. So it's a safe form of investment, so people are fairly interested in investing in bonding money. On the flip side, the Senate Republicans are likely to propose a bonding bill of less than $900 million. That's the suggestion I've heard from legislators. So you're going to have, I would bet that Governor Walz might be somewhere in the middle, but will definitely be closer to the DFL amount than to the Senate Republican amount. So what the outcome is, maybe $1 billion, maybe $2.5 billion, who knows? But there is obviously quite a bit of difference between those numbers. And so, like I said, there's going to have to be negotiations within the House, within the Senate, between the chambers, and then with the governor. So there's going to be a lot of fights there. Policy issues that will likely come up this session. So first and foremost, healthcare will for sure be an issue. I say that not only because it's an important issue, but also because it will be a campaign issue. And also specifically insulin. Insulin has been, I can tell you this week that Speaker Hortman did identify both bonding and insulin as being probably the top two issues to address this session. So healthcare will be one with insulin, not just because it's an important policy, but also because it's a great campaign issue. I do suspect firearms will be an issue again, just like it was last year. Again, mostly, I would say, I mean, again, it's an important policy issue, but I do think that there's, with healthcare and insulin, I think there's like a chance for there to be some real bipartisan support. With issues like firearms, there is a lot less of a chance for people to come to agreement, I think, just based on where legislators are ideologically and on their policy preferences. So I suspect that firearms will be more of a campaign issue than it is a policy change. Legalization of marijuana, same thing. I see that being more of a campaign issue, but I do know that it will be discussed. I do think if you've been watching the news over the last couple months, there has been a lot of issues with the Department of Human Services and its conduct over the lately. Some problems that have been recently discovered, but problems that have been going on for several years. So it wasn't just a Governor Walz problem, it was happening during the administration before that, which unfortunately places Governor Walz in a bad position where he's got to fix a problem that he didn't start. But there have been several different issues that have been addressed. One issue that has come up is failure to follow conflict of interest policies. Another has been overpayments that were not supposed to be paid, so the state has been paying out money that it should never have paid out. A variety of problems. So I suspect that there will be oversight and reform. There already has been technically informational hearings, which is essentially the same thing as a regular hearing, but they don't take an official vote. I know that they have already had informational hearings on that issue, and I suspect that it will continue. One suggestion I've heard is that they want to break up the Department of Human Services into 4 different departments. That, I think, has been suggested by Republicans, and I don't think that it's necessarily a hugely unpopular one, because I think there is a general agreement. My perception is I have heard that there is a general agreement that Department of Human Services is very large and does a lot. Now, whether that means they want to really break it up into 4 departments, I don't know. But that has been one of the suggestions. And of course, every other policy under the sun, they have dozens of committees in the legislature, and the committees all have different issues. So they will be addressing all kinds of different issues. What actually makes it to the finish line is a whole nother story, though. I do also want to point out, so in the legislature, there are 4 legislative leaders. There's multiple leaders, and there's like assistant and deputy leaders, but there are 4, big cheeses, so to speak. You have the Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman. She is DFL. You have the minority leader in the House, and that is Kurt Doudt. You have the majority leader in the Senate, which is Senator Paul Gazelka. He's a Republican. And then you have minority leader, which right now is Tom Bach, and he's a DFL. Like I said, there's also there's also majority leader Ryan Winkler, but really he works mostly under and with Speaker Hortman in the House. So Tom Bach is currently the Senate minority leader in this, but Senator Susan Kent, who represents the Woodbury area, has announced that she wants to seek her caucus's support to challenge Senator Bach for that position. That was announced in, I believe it was mid to late November or early December. Minority Leader Bach said he would gather the caucus to make a vote on that, but it still hasn't happened. He says he wants to wait until all 31 or 32 senators from the DFL party can get together. And so it's been delayed for that reason, although I have seen that there was, I think, a recent report where essentially someone said, a reporter asked, why haven't you met yet? It's been at least over a month now. And he said, we're still trying to find a time. And Susan Kent's response was, I don't know what the delay is. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, we'll see what happens. And whether in like big picture issues, it doesn't change the legislative outcomes too much probably because the minority doesn't have a whole lot of say of what happens in the Senate, except for bonding perhaps. But I think it will matter for what the Senate minority's messages are and priorities are and how that will affect the 2020 campaigning, to be frank.
Where is Tom Bach from right now?
He is from the Iron Range area. So the league will be working on redistricting. Paul gave a great overview of what we're really looking at, that we want enforceable standards, we want fair and effective representation, we want it to be timely, and we want it to be based on, substantially based on equal population. We want it, and that we are looking for ways to establish principles, change who is doing it, what people are doing it, from legislators to someone else, and then also other changes to the process, including, for example, public input. And that is coming under our People Powered Fair campaigns, Fair Maps campaign. And that campaign is not just legislative. Like a big piece of that is really just educating folks on what is redistricting, because most folks don't even know what that is. And we want to ensure that people know what it is. So regardless of whether you agree with the league's position or not, you at least have the ability to talk to your legislator about what redistricting is, even if you have a different position. I want folks to know what redistricting is so that when the redistricting process happens, they can participate in whoever they choose. Now, if they want to also work with the league, that's great. I'm not going to tell you no. Of course, I want folks, but the main issue is educate folks, advocate to everyone what we prefer our policies to be and see as being the best solution, is really being the key parts. If we can get a legislative win, I'll take it. But we want to make sure that we're having educated folks and we're trying to advocate to folks why certain policy positions are preferential. One of the other issues that the league will be working on is voter assistance. So Minnesota law limits a person to helping no more than 3 voters. So assistance usually means actually filling out the ballot with them. In Minnesota, like I said, that's limited to 3 people, but that has had some impact on communities where there's a lot of voters who are disabled or who don't speak English or read English. And an example of that is elder Hmong voters, because they might be citizens, but they might not be fluent in English. And so we have a lot of folks who need assistance to fill out their ballots because ballots are only available in English. You also might have some individuals, especially in the rural areas, that are visually impaired. So we want voters to be able to receive assistance from whoever they trust. And in fact, that's what it is at the federal level. The Federal Voting Rights Act has specifically said that voters are allowed to choose anyone they choose to assist them, as long as it's not their employer or their union rep. Anyone else can do it. It could be a legislator, it could be a candidate running for office, it could be their 13-year-old child. It doesn't matter. Whoever it is, it could be a person who's not a citizen. It doesn't matter who it is. The voter gets to choose who they want to assist them. And Congress's rationale was of anybody who can decide because they had this discussion about, well, we want to protect the voters so they're not manipulated, but we also want to leave them an option to pick who they trust. And then Congress decided, really, it's up to the voter. The voter is smart enough to decide who they trust to help them. So it's up to the voter. So Right now, similar laws to Minnesota have been challenged in other states. It's happened in Texas and it's happened in Georgia. And the court's response has been, the federal law says that it can be anyone other than the employer and the union, and the state is not allowed to make it more restrictive. So Minnesota's law is still at 3 voters, and there have been people who have approached the Secretary of State's office, the chief elections official in Minnesota, and said, we're going to sue you if you don't get rid of that law. So Secretary Simon approached the legislature last year, and Representative Vang in the House sponsored a bill that would remove that numerical restriction, because A, we should be giving voters assistance to who they choose, but also we don't want to get sued. That's expensive and that's pointless. Let's just avoid the whole problem by just fixing the law. Unfortunately, that did not pass last session, so we're going to approach the legislature again this year, and hopefully we'll get a little more movement. We'll see what they say. Here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that there was no hearing in the Senate. Senator Kiffmeyer, who is the chair of the Government and Elections Committee, did not hear the bill. When it was heard in the Elections Subcommittee in the House, I will say that when a vote was taken on the bill, there was no verbal no's from Republicans who were at the committee. So they didn't vote in favor of it, but they also did not verbally oppose it, which I think is helpful because, it really isn't, it's not just an issue. And when it got to the State Government Committee in the House, there were Republicans who expressed concerns about wanting to make sure that voters weren't manipulated. And, the league's position, and we submitted this in a letter to the legislature, is we're not saying that that's not a reasonable position to take and that's not something you shouldn't be worrying about. Obviously, we don't want voters to be manipulated. But the fact of the matter is that Congress already decided that for you. And it's not you don't have the option of changing that or make it more restrictive. And you're going to get sued if you don't, as Texas has, as Georgia has. So for the sake of the voters and for the sake of the state budget and for the sake of saving everyone time and effort, let's not do this. So we'll see what happens. I suspect that there will never be a hearing in the Senate with the current elections chair, but I hope that I'm proved wrong. So. Another issue is restore the vote. So if you aren't aware, in Minnesota, individuals who are convicted of a felony are not allowed to vote until they have completed their entire sentence for their conviction. That includes not only their time in prison, if they go to prison, but also their probation, parole, and supervised release. So a lot of Minnesotans, we actually have compared to other states, we have a fairly average to low incarceration rate. So the number of people in our prisons is lower on average. However, we have an abnormally high number of people who are in probation, parole, and supervised release. So they're not in prison, but they're still being supervised and are still serving for their, to some degree, serving. They're under supervision for their felony conviction. And not only is the number high, but also the time is high as well. There are people, and it's disparate from the metro area to the greater Minnesota. In the metro area, probation and parole and supervised release tend to be a much shorter time period, whereas in greater Minnesota, there have been folks who they're under supervision for over 20 years. And so there are people who they had a felony conviction when they were 18 or 19. And then they were convicted, and now they have a family, they have a job, they're paying taxes, they're serving their community, they're going to, they're participating in their community in every other way, but they won't be able to vote for 20 more years. So the point of Restore the Vote is to take that back, because is to change that so that only individuals who are still incarcerated. If you are not in prison on election day, and you are otherwise eligible to vote, then you should get to vote. So that's the movement of the Restore the Vote coalition that the league is a part of. It likely will not pass this session. We have had bipartisan support in previous years. We've had both Republican and DFL sponsors. The problem is that, again, there does not seem to be sufficient interest in the Senate to pass this bill. At least among leadership. We have talked to many Republican senators who do still support the bill, but there has not been enough support from leadership to prioritize it, to actually pass it off the floor to give it to the governor to sign. So we're going to continue working with the Restore the Vote Coalition this year. Even though we're not sure that it's going to get passage, we still want to make sure it's on legislators' minds and say, this is still an issue, don't forget about it. Yeah, so we'll still be working on that. Additionally, the League will still be working on legislative transparency. So if you have been following the news on the legislature over the last several years, you've probably heard things about late night meetings behind closed doors, bills that are 700, 900 pages long that legislators don't receive until 12 hours before they're supposed to vote on that bill. You may have heard of the tribunal, which is Majority Leader Paul Gazelka, Speaker of the House Melissa Hortman, and Governor Walz would essentially sit in a room together at the end of session, last few weeks of session, summon committee chairs from each chamber to the tribunal, as it was nicknamed, to discuss omnibus bills and say, what are your holdups? Why aren't you passing this bill? Why aren't you coming to agreement? They would then sit in judgment of that omnibus bill, direct the chairs, you need to get this figured out, this is getting figured out, that's nonsense, stop having a fight about that, and then send them back to pass omnibus bills, which would be passed with minimal discussion in the actual conference committees. So there have been lots of problems with the legislative process not being transparent and being unavailable to members of the public. It's gotten so bad that legislators themselves, legislators themselves will say, I have no idea what's going on. I'm in the minority, I couldn't tell you what's going on. Or I'm just a rank and file member. Even though I'm in the majority, I'm just a rank and file member. Right now, it's all conversations between the committee chair and leadership, and I'm not a part of that. You will also have lobbyists who will say, I have no idea what's going on. And my position is, and reporters also will have no idea what's going on. And my position is, if you have folks who are there, paid to be there on a full-time basis, who have no idea what's happening, how are you going to expect your constituents to know what's going on? So there seems to be a problem. I will say that it's not just this legislature, this session. This has been an ongoing problem. Back in the 90s, there was a legislative reform committee led by Representative Jean Pawlowski, who issued literally pages and pages and pages of suggestions of changes to the House rule or changes to the law to make the process smoother and go better and be more open and transparent, and so to stop some of the problems we're having. And they didn't take any, really didn't. They did pass some of those suggestions, but most of them they did not. So, and that was 20 years ago, and it's happening all over again because there is now another legislative reform subcommittee led by Representative Jean Pawlowski, who are discussing ways on how to improve the legislature. And I can tell you that there was a lobbyist who came to the first meeting of that subcommittee, sat down and said, I literally read this 20 years ago at the same committee, and I'm going to do it again. And he read literally the same exact testimony because it was the same exact problems happening. So, and there might be a lot of people who are like, I don't really care about how the legislature does it work. I just care about the policies that come out of it. Well, but the policies that come out of it are affected by how well the process works. So really, this is kind of a root problem that really needs fixed in order to make sure that our legislative process works well for all of our other issues that are super important to us. And we want, the biggest things are, omnibus bills are very large and they're mixing policy and finance together. So there are finance, they'll pass a budget bill, and this is true, they did it last year. They'll pass a budget bill that is 900 pages, and in it will be policy provisions that have no fiscal impact. So no money is spent on that provision, but they still wanted to put it into a budget bill. So they want to try and stop doing that because that really makes it difficult to really focus on the policy or really focus on the finance. Ideally they'd stop rushing around at the last minute with their, like chickens with their heads cut off. We would prefer that, they're taking their time, they're staying on deadline. And a lot of the negotiations are happening behind closed doors because it's happening between the the conference committee co-chairs, or it's happening just with a committee chair and legislative leadership, or it's just leadership with the governor. So those conversations happen behind closed doors. There are still technically conference committees that are open to the public and committee meetings that are open to the public that might run until 2 in the morning. But a lot of the actual negotiation content happens behind closed doors. And then they come to the conference committee and say, this is what we agreed upon, and then they vote on it. So that negotiation doesn't happen in public either. So those are some of the problems we're having with legislative transparency. And that's the end of my presentation. If you have any other questions regarding the legislative process or what we talked about, I am happy to answer those for you. Yes, relying on lots of questions. So yeah, and Paul's going to come up here too. So if you have any questions about redistricting or census, Paul's going to be here too to answer those as well.
Okay, I think, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
This sounds kind of bad. I think the legislative transparency thing, it's amazing. That sounds wonderful. But in reality, because you also said there's going to be an election, is that ever going to happen? Because somebody's going to say something, oh, I think you have a good idea, a Republican, it's going to say to a Democrat, oh, I have a good idea. Well, you know that's going to be on television every day, and he's going to lose the election.
So the thing
I mean,
about,
is there
yeah.
how do you balance all that?
Well, I mean, that's the constant struggle. And that's why things are such a mess, is because the legislature has comparatively a really short time frame to do a lot of work. The number of bills that are introduced have inflated over the last few decades. The amount of time they have has stayed the same. The number of constituents they have grown due to population growth. So there's just more work to do and not more time to do it. So they're trying to struggle with that problem. On top of that, there are like legislative rules that they're supposed to follow, that they're to do their process. But the person who gets to enforce that is the legislature. So unless there's political will for the legislature to enforce its own rules, it just doesn't happen. The only way to change that is if you get a rule that's important enough to put into the Constitution. That's really the only way you would get an enforceable rule that has to be followed, that you could get the court to enforce. Otherwise, it's really up to the legislature to enforce it. Yes? Oh, let's go here first.
How does Minnesota compare as far as the length of their session to other states?
Some states have a year-round session. Minnesota is one of the states that prides itself on having a citizen legislature. So that means that our legislators are not full-time. They're not full-time politicians. The intention is that they come from their community where they have a regular day job, they do their legislative work, they go home back to their day job, and are part of the community. So Minnesota has prided itself on that for a very long time. We have, over the years, grown the length of our legislative session and given more flexibility due to constitutional amendments. But relatively, I mean, we only have a session that usually lasts 4 to 5 months. So I can't remember what the average is for states, but I do know that some states are full-time year-round.
Do you feel like our current system is working?
I think, personally, I think that it is very difficult to keep up with the amount of work expected of legislators compared to the time they actually have. Now, whether that means citizens need to lower their expectations, or the legislature needs to expand the time it works, or whether we need to give up on the idea of a citizen legislature, that's all other conversations for other folks. Or maybe we need to limit the amount of the amount of work the legislature is allowed to give itself. So one of the suggestions has been to limit the number of bills that a legislator can introduce. That way you don't have 7,000, 8,000 bills introduced into the legislature, you only have 3,000, because then you only have so much work that you really can work on. So there's a whole wide variety of changes you could make beyond just timeline, but I think that people do really struggle with how short the time is compared to the growth of the amount of work, the amount of policy, and the number of constituents that have grown over time. Okay, I think you had a question.
That was my question. question.
Oh, okay. Great.
This is a question about the census and about getting census workers. Have you given any thought, Paul, on the type of things that League could do, or people who are interested in this work? What can be done to recruit census workers?
Oh, thanks, that's a great question. Yeah, I think part of it is making our members aware of the opportunities for employment, how to go about that, encouraging them to reach out to others, working with other trusted organizations, trusted messengers, whether there's other community groups, because really what we want is we want people, and the Census Bureau wants people who reflect the community they're reaching out to. So maybe minorities, Native Americans, things of that nature, who will have better access to the community. So that it's partnering with those other groups, whether through the committee or whether it's through other community interactions, tabling events, so where we can get out there, hey, there's these opportunities for employment. You know, we can help you with that information. You can help reach out to members of your community to get them involved in that. And that's what we've really been focusing on.
Thank you.
You had another question around here? Yes.
I have another question. There's been a proposed constitutional amendment about education.
Mm-hmm.
It's just been on the news, and
Mhm.
it was a Supreme Court judge, and I can't remember his name, that proposed it. Do you have any thoughts about it, or know anything about it, or?
I unfortunately don't know, because that's relatively a new issue to me.
Okay.
What I can tell you is that there are Senate Republicans who support it, and I can tell you that the Education Union opposes it. I have no position on it, the League does not currently have a position on it, but I can tell you that that's where things stand with those folks.
Yeah, the people you're thinking about, Alan Page, and
That's
folks
it,
who go
yeah.
justice,
Yeah.
and Neil
Yeah.
Kashkari, who's president of the
Right.
Minneapolis Federal Reserve, for the folks who
Yeah.
are bringing it forward.
Well, in my opinion, it sounds really good, because it says that every child will have a quality education. From what I understand, that's what it would say. And how do you make sure that every child has a quality education? Public schools right now are trying to give every child, well, in my opinion, a quality education. And I know,
I will say that Minnesota does, in its constitution already, have a provision requiring the state to provide public education,
right,
which not all states have that. Minnesota, but when Minnesota's constitutional framers came together, they said, the Constitution says something to the fact of like an educated electorate being necessary to
Right.
the republic or something like that. So we do already have a provision requiring and guaranteeing public education in Minnesota. This would go beyond that and do more.
I think it's something to watch.
What do we got?
Questions on both the restore the vote
Okay.
and the three-person.
Mhm.
If they don't pass, can the restore the vote, that could also go to the court, right?
Oh, okay, that's actually a good point. I didn't mention that. That's already in court. There is a lawsuit brought by by the ACLU, suing on this issue, saying that essentially there is not a rational basis to distinguish people who are on probation versus people who aren't, because and the people who are in prison versus people who aren't. So they're essentially saying, and they have a couple different legal theories that they're working under, but essentially they're saying this isn't allowed, and either the legislature needs to pass restore the vote or repeal the law that limits individuals with felony convictions from voting, or come up with a reasoned basis for why this is the way it is. And so that's what that lawsuit is that issue. I don't know much more beyond that. I can't think of much, but I do know that it is ACLU of Minnesota who is bringing that lawsuit.
Are there friend of the courts on the other side?
Yes, so the legislature has to defend against it, and the Attorney General's office is fighting against it, because that's the Attorney General's role, is to fight on behalf of the state. So AG Keith Ellison is fighting against it. The legislature and I guess AG is representing the legislature, but I suppose it is possible, because it has happened before, a chamber of the legislature could also be what's called an intervener and have their own attorney separately. But beyond that, there is an organization called Minnesota Voters Alliance that has also asked to be an intervener in the case. So what they essentially saying is, we have an interest, a strong enough interest in this case that we should be not even an amicus brief, which is essentially someone who just submits a brief, but they're not really a party who's like the ACLU is, or like the state is, but an intervener would be a full-on party to the lawsuit. So they say that they have enough interest that they want to be, that they should be an intervener. I don't know whether the Supreme Court has, or whether, I'm sorry, it's not in the Supreme Court yet, it's district court right now. I don't believe the district court has had a ruling on that quite yet. I am not sure what their standing would be. So standing in a court essentially says, are you the right person who actually has a vested interest in this issue? Because you can't just be any rando suing on any rando law. It has to actually affect you. And so whether or not the Minnesota Voters Alliance has standing is really going to be an issue there.
And which side are they on?
They are also against the lawsuit. They also say that they don't trust that the Attorney General can accurately fight the lawsuit because.
And just to refresh your memories, the Minnesota Voter Alliance was the entity that brought the lawsuit that allows, that resulted in now allowing political info on your person at the, which we were close to that.
So the case that Teresa's talking about was a U.S. Supreme Court case. Last year or the year before, I forget now. I think it was the year before. But was whether or not you could wear political messages, like political badges, pins, and insignias, I think was the language, in the polling place. And essentially the Supreme Court said you can definitely ban campaign materials. You can definitely ban materials that mention a political party. But beyond that, like, can you wear T-shirts and buttons and hats that say, for example, Black Lives Matter, or I support the NRA and the Second Amendment? Can you wear those into the polling place? And the Supreme Court said the way that you're enforcing that is not clear enough. You for sure can ban, campaign materials and party materials and candidate materials, but beyond that, you've got to have a really clear way of distinguishing what is political speech and what isn't political speech. And because the state didn't have a clear way of distinguishing, essentially the state now only enforces, the statute hasn't changed yet, but really can only enforce campaign materials, political party, and candidate. So yes, they were the party that actually sued the state and brought that to the Supreme Court to get that restriction limited. So, yes?
I have a question, and I don't know if this is necessarily something you guys specifically can answer, but I want to ask it nonetheless. So I'm aware there's an indigenous tribe in our area, which has a state highway right down the middle, and one of their biggest concerns is that voter turnout is low because half their people vote this way and half their people vote this way, and people don't know who goes where. And I mean, turnout isn't good because they don't have a polling place in their community. And I'm just wondering, like, what would be the steps necessary to help support that community in getting a polling place so they can all vote locally on the reservation?
Yeah, okay, so I love this question in so many ways, and that's why I was doing this little dance. This is the really nerdy stuff that I get so excited about. Okay, so what they would need to do is they would need to talk to their local election officials, not elected, election officials, about getting a polling place in the area.
Which would probably be the county clerk.
Yeah, probably be the county auditor. There might be someone else involved, but at a minimum, start with the county auditor. And that's who makes the determination. Unfortunately, I believe that polling place locations have to be set in February, so if they want it for the 2020 election, they need to be talking to them yesterday. What that also means is this is a really great thing to talk about, a point to talk about criteria and principles for redistricting. Because one of the things that a lot of states have followed are they often will use roadways to mark where a boundary of a district is. And that makes a lot of sense in many ways. But there are circumstances where you might split up what is called a community of interest. And this is an exact example of why redistricting criteria and principles are so important and how they're ranked are so important. Because if you're favoring, we just want an easy boundary that can be marked because there's a road there, then you will end up splitting a community in half. But if you favor communities of interest as a more important priority, you'll be able to say, look, we have a unit of voters who have a shared interest together, and they are a community, and they should be able to get representation that represents those issues and that fact. So we should make sure that they are together in a district so they can effectively advocate for their policy issues. And that's the whole reason of why redistricting is so important. And that also is why redistricting done by legislators can be difficult, because maybe there are legislators that benefit that community split up. So that is, I mean, I love that question because it touches on so many things regarding voting rights and redistricting, so that's why I love that question. But so that's why I hope folks here today understand that, like, really, this is the root of all other issues. If you're worried about anything in politics, any kind of political issue, and I don't care what your position is, but if you care about any kind of policy issue, then you need to be caring about census and you need to be caring about redistricting, because they affect everything else.
The other piece is recognizing community or governmental boundaries. So if you've got a tribal community, there are counties that are split, there are towns that are split. And every census there's, and Nick knows the detail, every census there's this one community that gets split in half. And they have to go back and say, no, you need to provide over here. And you get towns and then same deal. They get confused about,
Yep.
are we over here, are we over here?
Yep, and there's actually a couple of cities and towns in Minnesota that are actually split across the county. And so then you have to say, okay, even if you're saying you want to favor political boundaries of cities and counties, then are you going to protect the city or are you going to protect the county? You have to make that choice. So are those trade-offs that Paul was talking about that are really, you have to have that discussion, and that's why it's so important.
And that's why having maps drawn by the courts is problematic. They'll make sure you meet the legal requirements, but they're not going to look at community interests. They're going to be less rigorous in looking at existing political boundaries and geographic boundaries. They're going to get the legal requirements, and then you can't challenge them on a legal basis. You can say, well, this map doesn't work for me, but that's not.
It's not unconstitutional. Yeah, and that's
A map drawn by the court is only drawn by the court because the legislative map is challenged.
or they failed to come to agreement, which has really been the most problem, is they've just failed to come to agreement. But yes.
And see, in Minnesota, we've been fortunate that we've had split government. You know, if you go back 50 years, we've always had split government, so the legislature and the governor can't agree. Well, as soon as you have all of those in one party or the other, they're going to have an opportunity. Again, it doesn't matter which party it is, they're going to see that.
Yeah, and that's why I say, because we talk to a lot of legislators who say, well, the courts have done it, the courts do it fine. Why would I get involved and why would I bother changing that? And they say, A, because they're not supposed to, and we're relying on a broken system, and B, you know, they are also, like Paul was saying, not really looking to draw the best map possible for voters. They're looking at what is the minimum amount of change we can do to guarantee we're complying with the U.S. Constitution, the Minnesota Constitution, and really that's it, and federal law. But we're not going to go around trying to change anything else. We just want to like fix those things we have to and then get the heck out. So that creates problems because then you're not getting as much input and such. Now the courts do technically have public hearings, but they're not even like a legislative public hearing. They're technically a court hearing. So it's a much different structure and tone to what that hearing is.
And here's what, and if you get a legislator, which this is very common, they'll say, well, drawing the maps is my job. We want elected representatives doing this. You elect us to draw the maps. Why should I have a commission? Well, here's the thing. If you're in the minority in both houses, you have no seat at the table because it's all behind closed doors. It's an opaque process. If you have a nonpartisan commission, normally it's equal numbers of people from each party. At least you have a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm.
So it's insurance. You know, it's kind of like playing roulette.
Yep.
You can put all on black or all on red.
Yep.
And maybe you win and maybe you don't, but you're all in one way or the other.
Yep.
And so with a commission, you have a seat at the table, you have a voice, and it's going to be fair.
Yep. And if you're not at the table, you're on the table.
So that's, I mean, and that's a problem. There's a lot of legislators say, oh, this is my job. Well, maybe you can do your job, maybe not.
Or questions? What other questions do you have for us?
This is really a broader question, getting back to, restore the vote. Is there any push for overall criminal justice reform? Because I think one of the problems is that it takes hardly anything to be a felon. Mm-hmm. You know, the laws are such that very things that are just minor crimes are felons. So Is there any push for an overall criminal justice reform?
Yeah, so that has been a part of the conversation when folks are discussing restore the vote, is that, for example, there's been, inflation of what counts as a felony. When the Minnesota Constitution said the legislature could restrict individuals with felony convictions from voting, felony meant like murder and murder. And now, there's tons of things, and so there's tons of things that people can be convicted for that are counted as a felony. So that has been part of the problem, is discussing that. There also has been discussion about, right now it's very, the probation, the Sentencing Guidelines Commission has had a discussion about, they kind of make recommendations to the legislature on, do we need to be changing, how long a crime is punished for, how long the probations, how long are in prison, that kind of thing. And their latest recommendation has been, just this last month, was Minnesota needs to put a cap so that you're on probation no more than 5 years. No more of this 20-year nonsense. If you're going to put somebody on probation, put them on probation for 5 years. Now, that is good in many ways, because then you're not having 20-year probations, you're only having 5. The flip side to that is that I foresee that if that passes, then there will be more incarceration, because they know they can't put them on a long probation, but some judges might not be comfortable with that, so they'll say, all right, well, I have to just incarcerate you for a longer period instead. So I think that is a double-edged sword, and that can go either way. But so that's another criminal justice reform suggestion. There are also some organizations and individuals that would like complete enfranchisement. So regardless of if you are incarcerated, you would still receive the right to vote, and you would essentially cast an absentee ballot. It depends on how the state would count that. They might be counted in the prison as being their residence, probably. So, but that's another movement, is to simply do full enfranchisement as well. So.
And there are 2 states that have that. Maine and North Dakota both have no restrictions on felon voting.
Yep.
As well as Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has voting in the prison. That's
Yep.
what they do.
Well, and Florida just changed its laws to allow felons on probation to
Yep.
vote.
Yeah, so Florida just got to where Minnesota is now. So there is a movement across many states to do more enfranchisement, because there have been studies that even show, like, if the whole point of probation and parole is to get folks to be back in their community and to be productive members of society, there is evidence that pro-social activities, including voting, help that process work and help prevent people from going back to prison or committing crimes or violating probation and parole. So the idea is, if you really want this to be a rehabilitation and incorporate these folks into society, you need to give them the ability to participate in society, which includes the right to vote. We got any more questions?
Are there any attacks on voter rights anticipated?
Okay, so one thing that I can say, I didn't add it to this slide, but I do know that there has been more federal money appropriated to all the states for more election cybersecurity funding. I do think in Minnesota, the legislature has to approve for the Secretary of State to use that money. So in a lot of states, the money comes to the state, and then the Secretary of State is just like off to the races, spending that money on election improvements. That's not the case in Minnesota. The Secretary of State has to get permission from the legislature. And what happened last year was that the legislature really dragged its feet, the Senate really dragged its feet on that approval. I foresee that being a problem again. So I think that would be problematic, because we do know that U.S. elections have been under scrutiny for cyber security threats, international, and that's not me saying that, that's not Secretary of State saying that, that's saying U.S. intelligence officials saying that. So that's like the people who actually know. So that's my big message to folks, is like, if you have someone who says we don't have risks, tell them, what makes you better than the intelligence officials who know who really specialize in this, because that has been responses we've heard from some legislators is we don't really have risks. The other thing I would say is that provisional ballots are always a common theme and always get a hearing in the Senate. Provisional ballots are not right for Minnesota. So provisional ballots are when a voter goes to the polling place, if they aren't registered or they can't provide the documentation necessary to register, then they submit what's called a provisional ballot, which means they have to return to City Hall or the county office and prove that they're eligible within usually it's 2 weeks. Yeah, it can be as short as 48 hours. So people can vote, but then they have to come back to a government office again a week or 2 weeks later, which means they have to take time off work and find time to go there. Other states have it because it's required primarily by federal law. Back after the 2000 elections, after the 2000 elections, there were a lot of problems where people were showing up to polling places and election officials were saying, you're not registered, and they said, yes, I am, I don't know why I'm not. So Congress came up with a solution, which was provisional ballots. They said, other states that don't have a system set in place need to provide provisional ballots. So people it's supposed to be a safety net. If you're not registered or you can't register, the safety net is you get to cast a provisional ballot. If you can show evidence that that you are eligible within a short time period, then your ballot will be counted for that election. Minnesota was exempt from that law because we have same-day registration. And so that's the other talking point, is that legislators will say, well, 48 other states have provisional ballots. We should have it too. It's obviously a good idea. No, it's a good idea for those states because they were behind. Minnesota is ahead of the curve. So, and they only have it because it's required. Minnesota is not required to have provisional ballots because we have same-day registration. And
what I would say is that we had same-day registration. This is the 2002 Help America Vote Act that instituted that. And at the time the law was written, we had same-day registration. There are a lot of states who now have same-day registration who still have provisional ballots because they were required by law, and they use the various things. And I think it's Wisconsin was not required to have provisional ballots, but instituted anyway, even though it wasn't needed. Now, they have some voter ID requirements, and that's the other thing that drives people is the voter ID, which again, there's evidence on both sides of that whole thing. The other thing that I think I think, Teresa, where, other things from election security and access standpoint, we probably won't hear it in Minnesota, you'll probably hear it elsewhere. It is called Citizen Voting Age Population, CVAP. And the way that redistricting is done is around population, total population. That's how the census is done, that's how redistricting is done. And there are Supreme Court cases that and you can almost never get them to vote unanimously. 3 years ago, there was a 9-0 Supreme Court decision saying that you can't use voting age population, citizen voting age population for redistricting federal seats. That is something that people are talking about, and that is, I think there's a case, I want to say Kansas maybe, where they've done this for the legislature but not for Congress. And that's something that's going to get pushed. Because again, you think about citizen voting age population, it's going to skew older, it's going to skew less racially diverse, and that there's a reason for that. So you're going to hear that, and that's coming up in Texas in particular and some other states.
Yeah. And the states still use CVAP in limited circumstances, for example, to ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act, which requires that you don't dilute racial or language minorities. So you still need CVAP analysis in very limited circumstances, but only to ensure that there's fair representation in Congress and in the legislature. What other states have been looking at when they're trying to use CVAP is essentially to erase those constituents who wouldn't show up in CVAP, even though they do show up in the wider full population count.
Which state recently, or maybe it was just a county or something, made Election Day a holiday? They took away.
I can't remember which state that
it was. A state.
Yeah,
right?
so here's my opinion on that.
Okay.
Not really that great idea.
Okay.
So here's where I'm at. Minnesota has absentee voting.
Right.
So we have the ability, if you need to vote because you can't come on election day, you have 46 days to vote, which is great. And we want that. Election day as a holiday still doesn't solve the problem because there are a lot of folks who still have to work on holidays. So the idea is, if you're trying to ensure access to the ballot and that people have the ability to submit a vote, you really want to be focusing on policies that give them the time and ability to actually cast a ballot. And that's why I think that things like early voting and absentee voting and mail-in ballots are much more preferred policy. Because even if you are a state that doesn't have those, even if election day is a holiday, that really still prevents a lot of people from voting. It also makes election lines or voting lines longer if you only have that one election day, because everyone's going on the same day. When you have absentee and when you have early voting where you can go in and submit a ballot for 46 days, lines are much shorter.
So
But
Minnesota
a
has
holiday in combination with absentee ballots, early voting might be,
At this point, probably not. It'll probably have minimal effect because we have such good absentee and mail voting.
well, and we did have, Minnesota had the highest voter turnout of any state in the nation,
Yep.
including whatever state it was that had
Yeah.
holiday voting
Yep.
in 2000.
So-
What's a big element of turnout is civic engagement.
Yeah, yeah.
Because no matter what, and there's 3 states now that have 100% mail-in: Oregon, Colorado, and Washington, 100% mail-in. And so, and they actually, Census said they didn't really see a big difference in turnout.
How many states have a paper ballot, and what happens when we have a recount?
I don't know the current number of states that require a paper ballot. Minnesota requires a paper ballot, thankfully, since the Franken recount. We've required a paper ballot.
2006.
Yeah, we've required a paper ballot since then. And paper ballots are important because they do allow to have that paper record for a recount. During a recount, what happens is that those ballots are required to be stored for several years. And then also we have optical scan ballot counting machines. So they will actually scan the ballot as well. So there is a digital copy of that ballot as well. So we have digital copies and we have paper copies as well.
Yeah, and I've looked at this, and the numbers change all the time. And when you talk about paper ballot, there's a lot of variations on that. I mean, there's the old-fashioned paper ballot, punch it. There still are places that use those, very limited. Then there's the optical scan Nick is talking about, which we have and Iowa has. And so it's a paper that people mark. There's something called a ballot marking device, which is electronic. So you mark it and then it spits it out. I'm taking an election administration curriculum at the University of Minnesota. And we looked at examples of ballot response that people have from that Franken-Coleman election. And people are marking on the side, they're writing things in the corner, they're all over the place. And so there's rules, states, and that was also out of the 2002 law, is states have to have rules about how do you interpret voter intent. Well, a ballot marking device, the electronic thing, you can only get at the registry mark in the right spot. You color in the little hole, you mark the right spot. And then some of them spit it out, and so you get a paper thing that the voter gets, and they can put it there. Some of them just do an electronic tally, and you don't get something in the hand of the voter that says, here's what I did. So,
And that version would not be allowed in Minnesota.
it wouldn't be allowed in Minnesota. It's allowed by federal law. That's what Georgia's going to. There's a lot of controversy in Georgia right now about what they're going to.
Yeah.
Because there's questions about auditing and voter intent. It's kind of the Wild West right now about
Yes.
where people are voting.
Yeah. But I would say that the best practices are to have a paper ballot. That's where, I think that's the general agreement, is you need to have a paper copy. Don't just have an electronic voting and only electronic voting. If you have a ballot marking it needs assistance, then it needs to have paper involved. There's still also, I think, some issues people have, I haven't heard a lot, but there still are some issues with the ballot marking machines, even if they do spit out a paper receipt. But the point is, paper is the way to go, and people are actually moving towards Minnesota, because like I said, Minnesota's ahead of the curve on pretty much everything elections.
Great.
More questions?
Yay.
All right?
You know, this is normally our second Saturday league meeting, and I know sometimes we have announcements of upcoming events, or I know there's a change for the
What else is
Sleepy
going
eye.
on? Our legislators are coming.
Any announcements that we need to be aware of?
You don't have to put this up.
Yeah.
Received an email on the Welcoming Communities Assessment